We are back. Beautiful. All right, I have to hit the little button to continue here. So, had a great turnout last week. We need to have Steve back more often. He did a great job and appreciate him. And now you're back to people like me. So, good to have you here. If you can start our slideshow, we're going to do a little bit of review, some of the things that we've been walking through together. I feel like I have less commentary to share today and more of the story, because there are times I'm not sure that we're as familiar with the story as we might like to be. So do you have the slides there, Nathan? Here we go. Yes. Does anybody remember the movie, The Man Who Would Be King? Anybody besides me? It's one of my favorite films. And so I just did an allusion to that, the boy who would be king. We talked about the anointing of David and kind of all the trouble that Saul got into. Saul is the first king. He's handsome. He's a towering man, deeply religious, a man of genuine courage. And then he gets publicly humiliated and dethroned because he makes some really bad decisions. And if you might remember some of the terrible decisions that he makes, and it happens to all of us, don't we? I mean, you get into a place where things are going really well, and then you make one decision that kind of gets you into trouble. And he just continues to double down on this poor decision making. He can't wait. He's impatient, and his impatience gets him into trouble. He's supposed to do a sacrifice, but he's supposed to wait till the prophet gets there. He can't do it. He does this crazy thing about cursing his own army, and he ends up cursing his own child. And then he is supposed to kill all the Amalekites, including all their livestock, and down to and the king. And he just decides for himself, you know, I think it'd be better to keep the best stuff. Let's sacrifice the best stuff separately. I'm not going to kill the king. I'm not going to kill some of the prime livestock. And one of my favorite lines is where Samuel comes up and says, "Is that the bleating of sheep I hear?" Knowing that he has been caught in almost obedience. So we've been talking over the last several weeks about the kind of things that we're chasing. And as men, we tend to chase pretty hard after things. And he is chasing after almost obedience. And I shared with some men the other day my remembrance of Get Smart. Missed it by that much. Missed it by that much. Do the people on the screen see the slideshow, or because it looks like I'm just seeing them?
Slideshow.
Can y'all see the slideshow?
No.
It's going to be even more boring without being able to see the slideshow. There we go. There we go. Okay. So he has three major failures, and it moves into almost obedience. And as I said, it's my, it reminded me of Get Smart, where he can always continue to be almost get it. He just never quite got it right. And he would say, missed it by that much. And most of us are old enough to remember that. So there we go. Next slide. Is that coming? There we go. Missed it by that much. Over and over again. And you would hope that Saul could get smart, but he doesn't seem to. And so Saul's fallen out of favor. And we remember the story where Samuel grieved over Saul. And in grieving over Saul, he spent so much of his time looking backward and lamenting over past mistakes. And we tend to do that as well, don't we? We tend to spend a lot of our time looking in the rearview mirror, lamenting over past mistakes. And it was time for Samuel to stop looking back and to start looking forward, looking for a new leader, looking for someone who was worthy. But it was still not what he expected. And he eventually is told to anoint David as king. And you remember, it's like the Cinderella story. They bring in every other brother, and after every brother that they bring in, none of them are good enough. And finally, they bring in one who is ruddy, handsome, and has beautiful eyes. And we're told God does not look on outward appearances, but those details are included in the text for some odd reason. And then Samuel's not exactly sure what to do until God says, this is the one. You need to anoint this one. And so he anoints him. And you'll remember that the term anointing is also the anointed one is the term for Messiah. So here we are in the city of David. It's not the city of David yet, but it's Bethlehem, which means house of bread or house of meat, which I think is interesting. House of bread or house of meat. And in Bethlehem is where the anointed one is crowned, is where the anointed one is chosen. And so it makes sense that later on the anointed one shows up in Bethlehem of Judea. And after David's anointed king, he tries to soothe Saul by playing his lyre. And there's a great scene there where David soothes Saul's troubled soul. And then, as Matt preached on this past week, David then gets to defeat Goliath. And, with 5 smooth stones, he's able to defeat Goliath. And that kind of gets us close to our story today. God defeats Goliath through David. It's not really David. I really love the way that Matt put that together this week. It was not David defeating Goliath. It was God defeating Goliath through David. And I talked with somebody yesterday who was going through some struggles, and I said, did you see the sermon Sunday? And she said, I didn't. I said, well, you need to go back and listen to it, because you're facing some giants of your own. You're facing some large struggles of your own, and you're trying to do it by yourself. And I loved the way that Matt put it. He said, Saul looked at the giant ahead of him and said, there's no way I can win. And David looked at the God who was behind him, and he said, there's no way I can lose. If God is for us, who can be against us? And so that leads us into the rest of this story. This is the uncut version. I use that term loosely, the uncut version. As you hear more of this story, that will hopefully be funnier. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. He's not using the weapons of someone else. He's using his own weapons. He's using his own giftedness. He's using what God has given him, as opposed to trying to do something that is someone else's gift. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He drew his sword. And this is the part where Matt cut it off. He's like, read this at home for your kids. And I know some of you did go home and read it like you were supposed to, but I just want to make sure you got this. Then David ran, stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of the sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head. So keep this picture in mind as we keep going in the uncut version. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. There's an echo in here. Yes, they fled because they thought there was no way in the world that this massive mountain of a man could ever be defeated. It's just kind of like Game of Thrones. Any Game of Thrones fans? It's just kind of the mountain there. There's several people like this who you think can never be defeated, and somehow they get defeated. The troops of Israel and Judah rose up with a shout, pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on their way from Sharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. The Israelites came back from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camp. And now we still have the head, okay? David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in the tent. Okay. And then this passage goes on to kind of lead us where we're headed today. Saul saw David go out before the Philistine. He said to Abner, the commander of the armor, Abner, whose son is this young man? We're trying to, definitely establish his lineage and who he is. Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. The king said, inquire whose son the stripling is. One of our United Methodist churches out in Carrollton is Stripling Chapel United Methodist. That's a terrible acronym for a church. Stripling Chapel United Methodist. Think about it. On David's return from killing the Philistine, Abner took him, brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. So he's continuing to carry Goliath's head around. I mean, this is just kind of a funny scene, I think. He's just carrying the head of this guy. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite. That takes us all the way to our conversation that begins for our scripture text today. I just wanted to make sure that y'all were on board. Everybody remembered all the things that had happened. And the lectionary text for this week moves to 2 Samuel. I mean, we just kind of run through. We're doing 8 weeks of David. We could do 80 weeks of David. We're only doing 8 weeks of David, and it's such a rich story in 1st and 2nd Kings. And I've chosen to preach on these particular verses this week as opposed to preaching on a poem. Has anybody ever tried to preach on a poem? You know, you don't preach on a poem, you read the poem and you let the poem do its work. You let people hear the poem. That's why you don't hear a lot of preaching on the Psalms. You ever heard a lot of sermons on the Psalms? I mean, the Psalms are the songs of the people, and you'll occasionally hear someone preach from a Psalm, but often the Psalm just needs to echo and be read and be in people and not to be explained, because when you explain a poem, you seem to have lost the power of the poem. So you just tell the poem. It's like when you have to explain your jokes, Brian. I mean, it's one of those things. So I want you to listen carefully or read carefully along with me here, Jonathan's covenant with David, because this is going to be, I think, the meat of our conversation. I'll tell you some more about all the things that happened between Saul and David. But here we go. When David had finished speaking to Saul, still with the head in his hand, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David. Interesting language. The soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Now he's found out who his father is, and now he's decided that I'm going to keep you here with me and not let you go back to Jesse the Bethlehemite. And I think some of that is that he wants to kind of tap into David's power, but I think there's also some need to control. And in that need to control, he sets himself up for failure. He's not willing to let God be in control of this. He wants to be in control, and we tend to grasp for control ourselves as well. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. You rarely hear language like this in the biblical record about loving another person with their own soul. We talk about soulmates, right? You've heard people talk about soulmates, but this is a soul friend. And I want us to think together about our soul friends. Who are our soul friends? Who are people in our lives? There are other men in our lives that we can say, I loved him as my own soul. Do you have relationships like that? Have you found relationships like that? What does it mean to develop relationships like that? And so in order to show how they're bound together, soul to soul, Jonathan strips himself of his robe that he's wearing and gave it to David. He strips himself of his armor. He strips himself of his sword, his bow, and his belt. And he takes all of this off and gives it to David. And really, at this point, he is abdicating the throne, because you remember Jonathan is Saul's son. And if he's Saul's son, he's first in line to the throne. But he has seen David defeat Goliath. And even though he's had some incredible military victories himself, I mean, he's done some incredible winning against the Philistines himself. He sees that there's something special about David. And rather than resenting David and becoming jealous of David and trying to put distance between himself and someone else who might take his place, he sees the giftedness of someone else and he pours into him, which I think is a beautiful thing. When you see someone else's giftedness and decide to pour into them and not to resent their gifts, but he gives up his own place and humbly gives everything away to say, David, you're in, you're welcome, you're a part of us. Anybody have a son-in-law? Anybody a son-in-law? Did your father-in-law do this for you, sons-in-law? Did they welcome you like this? Did they do something like this? I wonder what it would mean for father-in-laws to do this for their son-in-laws. My dad never called my wife or my sister-in-law his daughters-in-law. I've told you this before. He called them his daughters-in-love. He said, I hope it wasn't law that brought you into the family. I hope it was love that brought you into the family. And if it's love that brings you into the family, you are my daughters in love. And he always treated them as his daughters in love, not his daughters-in-law. And I just wonder if we ought to have a ritual for welcoming a son-in-law into the family, right, Michael? You know, what would that mean to ritually invite them? What would you have to give them to let them know that they're in? David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. So everything is going great now. Saul is happy. David is happy. Jonathan is happy, even though there's someone who is finding his father's affections. But then things start to go poorly. So we turn to the next verses. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistines, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs of joy and musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed thousands, but David tens of thousands. He's better than you, Saul. And, it's just sort of like that. I see the women, like jumping rope, and they're just, chanting this little nursery rhyme as they're taunting him on the playground. Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed tens of thousands. And as they just have this simple nursery rhyme, this simple thing, it starts to get under Saul's skin. Has that ever happened to you? Just something small just sort of got under your skin. I mean, and it really makes him angry. And it says, Saul was very angry, for this saying displeased him. He said, they've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've only ascribed thousands. What can he have but the kingdom? And so Saul eyed David from that day on. Let's stay on the slide for a little while. Saul gave him the eye. You ever had somebody give you the eye? He eyed him for that. He kept an eye on him. And one of my friends has shared with me an illustration like this, and I really like it. So you can tell in an organization when someone else is going the opposite direction from anyone else, can't you? I mean, when you have somebody who is going a total different direction, they are easy to identify. But what one of my consulting friends says, the problem that you have sometimes in an organization is someone who looks like they're going the same direction that you are, but they're just 1 or 2 degrees off. So they feel like they're headed in the same direction, but because they're 1 or 2 degrees off, they start colliding with other people in the organization, and they look like they're part of you. They look like they're headed in the same direction, but because they're 1 or 2 degrees off and they're not fully aligned with your purpose and they're not fully aligned with your goals, they cause more havoc than the person you can easily identify going the other direction. Saul seems to think that David is the person going the other direction, but it is clear in the text. It is clear over and over again that there is nothing underhanded about what David is doing. There's no scheming in David's heart. David's just doing what he's been asked. He's doing what he's been told. He seems, at least in this part of the scripture, to be as faithful as possible. David's life is a gift, is God's gift to Saul, and Saul takes it as a gift for a few minutes, but then this starts to get under his skin and he begins his assassination plot. Over and over again, he decides to kill David. I think there's some 6 times. If you go back and read the text, you'll find there's some 6 times that he decides to get rid of him. Here's the first one. The next day, an evil spirit rushed upon Saul, and he raved within the house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. So here he's trying to throw a spear at him twice, and it reminds me of y'all at burying the hatchet. If Saul had been with you, he would have been able to work this out. He would have been much better if he had, had axe throwing lessons with y'all. But because he didn't go to axe throwing practice, he misses David twice. Let's go back and finish out that text, if you will, Nathan. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. I think that's a really sad commentary, is that Saul feels like the Lord has departed from him. I do feel like the Lord has rejected his leadership, but I'm not sure it's the same thing that the Lord has departed from him. I do think the Lord was still with Saul, but he no longer was willing to have him lead the people. I don't think the Lord abandoned him. And because Saul felt that way, Saul removed himself from his presence and made him a commander of thousands. And David marched out and came in leading the army. And he doesn't send David out just because he thinks he's a great leader. He sends David out because if I can't kill him with a spear, maybe one of the Philistines can. He is hoping to set him up to be killed. When Saul saw that he had his great success, he stood in awe of him. But all of Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in leading them. And you remember, they wanted a king from the very beginning. They wanted a king. And what did they want the king to do? To go out and fight their battles for them. And they thought Saul was going to do that. And he did it for a little while, but couldn't do that against Goliath. David does that. And then David continues to be the king. And you'll see later on in David's life, if you remember the story of Uriah the Hittite, he stays home and gets himself into trouble and is no longer leading people into battle. He sends Uriah out, and that's when he gets in trouble. So then we move on to David marries Michal, Michael, depending on how people pronounce it. Then Saul said to David, here's my eldest daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, I'll not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines deal with him. So here it is. He's like, I'm going to let the Philistines kill him. It's not going to be blood on my hands, but I'm going to set him up and I'm going to use my daughters as bait. So this is not a son-in-law at all or a son-in-love. This is a son-in-law that he's setting up. And David said to Saul very humbly, who am I and who are my kinfolk? I mean, the tribe that he's a part of is the least of the tribes of Judah. And how can my father's family in Israel, who are my kinfolk, that I should be the son-in-law of a king? But at that time, when Saul's daughter should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, as a wife. So he set him up, said, go out into battle, and then I'll make you my son-in-law. And then when push comes to shove, he doesn't get to be the son-in-law again. But he's got more daughters, don't worry. He's got more daughters. Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. Saul was told the thing pleased him, and Saul thought, let me give her to him that she may be a snare for him. Isn't that an interesting way to think of your child? That she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistine may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law. False promises. Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, see, the king is delighted with you and all his servants love you. Now you will become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants reported these words to David in private. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and of no repute? I don't deserve this. There's no way. I'm marrying well above my station. And David must feel like there's something else going on here because he doesn't seem to deserve it. And the servants of Saul told him, this is what David said. Then Saul said, thus used to say to David, the king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Told you this was the uncut version. The king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Now, when any of you sought to get married, what's that? This could be the cut. Yes, just to see if you're paying attention. The king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins. Has that ever happened to any of you? You thought about getting married and your potential father-in-law. And if some of you have somebody, they come and ask for your hand in marriage, you're like, I just need one thing. That's all I ask for you is I need a sack of foreskins, so to speak. It's the craziest ask. I mean, what is David, what is Saul really, I mean, is this a joke? Does he think that David wouldn't do this? It is the weirdest, sort of dowry ever. The king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged on the king's enemy. Now, Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. He's going to have 100 or more angry Philistines at this point. When his servants told David these words, David was pleased to be the king's son-in-law. David doesn't think anything of it. So David goes out and inquires them. Before the time had expired, David rose and went along with his men and killed 100 of the Philistines and then brings back the foreskins. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, people, understand some of the things that are in the biblical record. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king. There are no literalists who are like, when you get married, this is what you need to do. Nobody ever says this is, what. Fran, did you ever do that to your son-in-laws? Did you? And they were given in full number to the king. Somebody counted. Somebody counted. There's not just an approximation here. Somebody counted these. They were given in full number to the king that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul then finally gave his daughter Michal as a wife. I mean, how could you refuse? How could you refuse? But when Saul realized the Lord was with David and that David's daughter Michal loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. And then the commanders of the Philistines come out to battle. And as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his fame became great. And then I said the lectionary for Sunday is a poem. You can go back and read it. It's 1 Samuel 1. You start at the first verse, and then you start with the 17th verse, and you can read that yourself. I just decided not to preach on that. And I don't think we have time to continue to talk through where Jonathan intercedes for David, but I'm just going to kind of throw out the highlights. His dad, Saul, continues to try and want to kill David. And Jonathan's loyalty is not to his father. Jonathan's loyalty is to the covenant that he made with his friend David. Now, he doesn't do anything to hurt his father, but because of their bond, because of the depth of their friendship, because their soul is bound to each other, because Jonathan has chosen to make a covenant with David, he tells David about what the plans are. He warns David. He calls David and relates all these things to him. And in chapter 20, Jonathan says to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. There is a great bond between these two men. It is one of the strongest examples of friendship in the biblical record. I have a colleague, there's a Lutheran pastor whose last name is Foss, and he served down here at Church of the Redeemer. I don't know if anybody, Redeemer Lutheran, if anybody has any experience down there. And he was brought in there, and it didn't work out, but he has 6 marks of discipleship that I think are really helpful. He says you should be involved in weekly worship. You should go to worship every week. You should be involved in daily prayer. You should be involved in daily study of the scripture. And then he throws in one that I had never seen in any other discipleship sort of list before. He says, and you need to develop spiritual friendships. Not just buddies, but spiritual friendships, right, Pat? Spiritual friendships that call you to examine your life, that call you to something more. And I just thought it was a beautiful thing. And it's not usually on the list of things that we ask people, prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. We ask you to, support the church in those ways. But we never say, we expect you to find good, strong Christian friends, spiritual friendship that will uphold you and also hold you accountable, that will pick you up when you fall, that will hold you and keep you from falling. And so you can see as you read back through these stories of David and Jonathan, spiritual friendship. And he continues to warn him. He continues, and even Saul gets so mad that he throws a spear at his own son. 6 times he tries to take David's life. And so I'm going to go down to the very end, if you will. I think it's number 38, and go, because I'd like to give you time for discussion. But it's the second to last slide, if you can get there. It's back to that very same story at the beginning. What does it mean to have a spiritual friend? It means to love that person as your own soul. It means to make a covenant with someone. He makes a covenant with David. And to make a covenant is to say God is the third person in our relationship. It's not just me and you, Brian. It's me, you, and God. We can be friends, But in order to truly be friends, to be friends, we're asking God to help seal the deal, for God to be in it. It's not a contract, it's a covenant. And it's asking God to be involved in that. And so Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And then he has to give something up. He gives something up to let David know that his commitment is not mere words. It's not an idea. He has to give something up to help that person feel welcome. And as I said, I wonder if that would be a really great ritual for us. Years ago, my son was a counselor at Camp Glisson. And at the end of the summer, they had to give a sacrificial gift. Has anybody ever heard about this concept? At the end of the summer, you had worked with these counselors and you'd been with them day in and day out for 10 weeks with kids from all over North Georgia. And at the end of your time there, you picked a name of another counselor out of a hat, and you had to give something to that person that you really valued. And it was a struggle for these kids. I mean, they're somewhere between, 19 and 23 years old. And they're asked to take something really important. And so my son once was paired with this young woman, and she came and she undid her confirmation necklace that her parents had given her, that she had worn around her neck since she was 12 years old, and made her commitment to Christ. And she took that off her and handed it to my son. My son kept that for the next 10 years and then recently decided that she needed it back, which I thought was a beautiful thing that he cared for it for that long. But a sacrificial gift can help make a bond of friendship. And I'm going to be talking on Sunday. I don't want to give it all away, but I talked with a Catholic priest this week. And when I told him that I was preaching on this, he said, it's like battle buddies in the Army. Any Army people in here? Anybody serve in the Army? And he said, you have to have a battle buddy. And I've talked to some older Army people, and they didn't know what that was. But younger people in the Army know what a battle buddy is. And I'll be talking about having a battle buddy going forward as part of my sermon Sunday. So Jonathan and David become battle buddies that involve sacrifice. So there's just some questions I'd like you to think about. What are the qualities of a spiritual friendship? What makes something a spiritual friendship? Not just somebody who's your buddy, who's your pal. What makes something a spiritual friendship? And how might we develop deeper friendships? And then finally, to share with your friends around the circle, around the table, what is one friendship you'd like to deepen? Because what they say to us today is that people have more connections than ever before. They have more connections, they have more likes, they have more friend requests, they have more connections than ever before, but people are lonelier than ever before. People are lonelier than ever before. And it's not that people need to have more connections, but they need to go deeper in some of the few connections that they have. I talked with a young man in recent days who has lost a good friend. And to lose that kind of deep connection is really painful, right? I mean, to lose that deep connection is really painful, especially when you only have a few of them. And so what does it mean for us to invest? And so I'd like you to share a name, or even not share a name, but just say you've got someone and write it down or put it on your phone, and work in the days ahead to work to deepen that one relationship. And the studies say that the way that you deepen a relationship is you spend time with that person. It's consistent. The second thing is that your interactions with them are more positive than negative. Anybody have a friend or an acquaintance who 9 times out of 10, they're complaining about something? My wife has a friend, colleague, who, whenever they get together, she just wants to bash her husband. That's all she wants to do. And my wife is like, I'm out of here. There's certainly things that she could bash about me, but she decides that that's not a healthy friendship for her, because that's not what she wants to talk about. And her best friend, they never male bash. They spend their time talking about helpful and hopeful and positive things, not bashing their husbands. And that's why she's most attracted to that friendship. And the last thing is vulnerability. So vulnerability, connectivity, and positivity. Vulnerability, consistency, and positivity are three things that we know from research that helps build friendships. So thanks for your time and attention. Be careful ducking spears this week. And, when you are asked to go out and gather 100 of anything, be careful what you're asked for. So I hope you'll spend some time in conversation. It looks like we can do three groups. I don't know that we have 4 in here.